from poor to the very rich of the first world, do Maoist third worldists see all of the first world as the enemy, and all of us as the primary contradiction in this relation between the first world and the third world, since we are the beneficiary of imperialism, or in traditional Marxist analysis, do they see the bourgeois capitalists, solely the first world ruling class, as the main and only true enemy when regarding the primary contradiction of capital and labor, and the other subjects, such as first world people, including middle class and working class, as secondary contradictions? Actually, what we see is that imperialism remains the primary contradiction, just as it was with Lenin, just the same as it was with Mao, except here it's different. Lenin saw it as the oppressor countries and the colonialized countries. What we've seen is a quantity into quality change, where we now live in an age where there's one all-encompassing superpower. So there really is no competing international capitals anymore, as U.S. capital now completely dominates the entire planet. They have investments in every single country in the world, even the other imperialist powers. So there really is no interest in going to war, other than a slight challenge by Vladimir Putin. And even then, I would say, Putin is no threat to the United States. He isn't. I mean, Russia cannot beat the United States in a war. It's just not going to happen. I mean, if the nukes started flying, everybody loses. But assuming they keep their heads, it's just not going to happen. What we definitely have is a united first world against the third world. All the rich, privileged countries that carry out the exploitation have band together in a position with the United States. That's why look at the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Come on, that was totally the first world all working together against a third world country. And the same thing with Iraq. So the primary contradiction really is the first world and the third world. What we see is that the, quote-unquote working class people in the first world, their living standards make them comfortable enough being bought off with the spoils of imperialism, so that they're not willing to actually really fight. And that is a problem in itself. Thus, we cannot rely on first world people to actually, rise up against their oppressors. They don't have a revolutionary potential. I mean, look at them. One of their rallying causes is to raise the minimum wage. Why would Marxists, incentivize people to come to them with a higher minimum wage when you can get that through the Democrats? And the Democrats are already pushing it. It's kind of really pointless. So it really is more to say that it's the first world and the third world that is a primary contradiction. And a big part of that is first world people having lost their revolutionary potential. I don't think there's really any question about this if anybody's being really honest. In over 100 years of organization in the first world, they've yet to produce anything. And yet you've got people like the NPA or the Naxals who've been fighting for like 40 years. Like literally doing revolution for 40 years. And you've got the FARC, almost about 40 years. So I don't think there's any question in that way. You and pretty much other Maoist third worldists that I've encountered speak of Marxism as a science that evolves, which I believe is the correct way to look at it, instead of how these dogmatic Marxists view the material world. And that is why I'm asking you these questions, to see as the material condition changes, it appears that an antagonistic relationship between the first and third world people is materialized. Do you think their relation has turned antagonistic rather than one of solidarity? Yes, I actually believe so. I don't think that there's really any solidarity across the first world to the third world. I mean, there are nice statements by Marxist groups of solidarity, but that's where it ends. It only exists there. In the real, actual working class people in the United States, or the first world, they generally just don't care about third world people. They don't. I mean, an individual Marxist group can care, but the population at large, the ones that are supposed to have the revolutionary potential, don't care. And even those that do care can be bought off by sending $1 a day to the third world under some phony charity. So I would say that the fact that first world people won't rise up and refuse to rise up, and they do so because of the violence and exploitation that's carried out against third world people, I think that does place them in an antagonistic contradiction with third world people. Would a forced migration of North Americans of European descent back to Europe really be preferable to genocide? Americans like all that free market stuff, and it might get a kick out of people not being able to afford to escape the purges. All shipping those people back to Europe would tax the new society's resources, and Americans could also be used as slave labor. I see really, this was an idea that was being put around by MIM, the Maoist International Movements, one of the first third worldist groups. This idea of simply kicking out all the white people back to Europe, it's not going to work. Like, I would love to see what kind of force you could put together to actually make that happen. It's frankly just nonsense to kick all the white people out of North America. It's just not going to happen. You know, it's just such a tremendous waste of resources. It's completely nonsensical. In your video, Resistance and Revolution, you posit that the only thing first world communists ought to do is essentially participate in wrecking behavior, i.e. vote in anti-imperialist right-wingers, participate in anti-war demos, hinder military infrastructure, and so on, all towards the goal of committing national suicide in order to hinder first world powers long enough that maybe give third worldists, I would say third worlders, but not third worldists, a shot at making revolution. I have nothing against this notion. Believe it's an essential part of communism already. Under the principle of internationalism, where I fall off with you is on this one though, is your denunciation of organizations for revolution in the first world. I don't see why it can't be both. Couldn't a party both work against imperialism alongside making inroads with oppressed peoples and sympathizers of the first world for the purpose of meaningful social change, not seeking mere concessions? Surely an organization developing purely for wrecking like the RAF would face similar results, unless you have a differing perspective on the RAF's impact, which I'd love to hear. I would say that if first worldists actually got a revolution, which I would say they're not going to. They can't. And that's just a fact. They're not going to get the job done. They've had over 100 years to organize, and they've never even come close to a potentially revolutionary situation. So I would say it's a massive waste of resources. It'd be a lot better just to send it to the third world. Second, anytime you struggle for the first world, you're struggling to defend it. If you raise the minimum wage in the first world, you're killing more of the revolution potential. If they won't fight now at like $7, $8 an hour minimum wage, what makes you think they're going to fight when it's $15 an hour? Like, first worldism is inherently self-contradicting. It's self-sabotaging. It just doesn't work. Historically, it has always failed. You're trying to organize a labor aristocracy, in which case the only thing they can do is increase the exploitation on the third world, which is not a good idea, because it doesn't work the same way there as it works here. So I would say that there really is no point to doing it. I mean, let's say by some miracle scenario that they actually won, and there was actually a revolution in the United States. Exactly what would happen once you ironed out or rebalanced global wealth? You would have to transfer an astronomical amount of wealth back to the third world. First world people would drop astronomically. Now let's assume that the revolutionizing party was actually willing to do that, which I don't think they would. First world people aren't going to stand for it. But once you take that much wealth out of the country, they're going to demand that the old ways come back. It's like noticing how if you're just because you're revolutionary and doesn't mean the people around you, the regular everyday people, are also revolutionary, because they're not going to stand for that. They're not going to materially benefit. You can't expect them to have a global class consciousness when they don't even have a consciousness for their own class in the first world. The fact is, once that value shrinks first world living standards, they're going to revolt, and they're going to turn against the Vanguard party. So I would say that there really is no point to even trying to do that here. Wrecking activity is a lot better. National suicide really is the answer for a first world struggle. One of your running themes or points that there's no revolution potential in the first world. Your claim being that we in the first world have it too good to actually go out in the business of making a revolution. Red flags, DACA, and whatnot. I don't disagree with you on this, but I believe revolution can come when people's everyday lives are seriously impacted. Their basic needs must be breached or sufficiently precarious. That being said, I don't think it's accurate to say that there is no revolutionary potential. Only means that they, could, not that they need. Okay, I had to cut this one down because this question was really, really long. But this is exactly what we're saying. In this situation, where we are right now, there is no potential. It does have to be broken down before that potential can be there. It's not here now, but it has to be transformed through essentially accelerationism. But that accelerationism can't really be done here. It has to be done by the third world cutting off the first world from its supply of super exploitation. So, we're really not disagreeing here. What do you think about the growing separatist movements in the first world? It seems to me that a lot of people are starting to turn towards their local reasons for identifications of their nationality, particularly in the U.S. Do you think the U.S. could ever split apart like the Roman Empire? And would this split provide an opportunity for revolution? I think that it could potentially create a better condition for the third world. It's questionable. Even if the United States were to break off into 50 separate states, how much cooperation across those states for imperialist goals could there be? I don't think it'll happen because the capitalist class realizes that it needs the U.S. military to defend their interests around the world, to cover their national bourgeois interest. So it's not going to happen. Because if you got rid of the U.S. military by breaking it down to 50 smaller ones, it just wouldn't happen. So I don't think it means anything. Like, you could push for these separations, but they wouldn't actually happen. It's just not something that can happen. If a laborer does not add value but performs labor, why would a capitalist keep them employed if they were not being exploited? Even a retail worker performs a function on average that causes the capitalist to make more money than they receive back in wages. If this were not the case, the capitalist would not keep them employed because his profit margin would increase without them being on the payroll. I would say that this is not actually true. Retail workers are part of a necessary function of getting the product to the customer. Even though they don't add value, it's still part of a necessary function to get the sales. They have to get the product to the customer. There's no getting around this. The capitalist can't stand there in the store by himself and do everything that it takes to run a store. CEOs don't add any value either, but they're an absolutely necessary function. They fulfill that completely necessary function in getting that whole system to work. So that while no, retail workers technically aren't exploited, they are still needed to facilitate that whole process of capital accumulation, because you couldn't just have a store with no sales clerks. Do you think first worlders are entirely incapable of fighting the government in a substantively revolutionary way? Yes. Because you have to reach the masses. The masses have to rise up. And they're not willing to do that in the first world. So I would say the question of actual, tactics is meaningless. Because what does it matter if the people aren't on your side anyway? There was a very significant resistance in Northern Ireland that is regaining momentum. They just bombed a UK military base in Derry recently. Would you say national liberation struggles are the exception to the rule? Actually, I would say to a large degree, yes. I'd say some national liberation struggles, although they aren't, because these aren't the same things as Marxist struggles. For example, the resistance in Northern Ireland doesn't necessarily have to be Marxist. It just has to kick the British out. So while it's not really a class-based revolution, it's still a national liberation struggle that is a struggle for people who have been oppressed by the UK. So it is right to do so, but how beneficial would be to revolution, I don't know. For example, black resistance, Native American resistance. It's absolutely right to rebel, for them to defend themselves and for their own self-determination. But would that bring Marxist revolution? No. But it is a necessary resistance. Personally, I think first worlders can fight in some rare situations in terms of resisting imperialism. In the first world, the best thing would be to join a Marxist party and spread information about communism. Resist imperialism and rally as many people on the idea as possible. What's your opinion on this? I would say even if you did win them over, you would win some people. you wouldn't win Americans over to communism. It's just, you're asking them to do something that they can't do, lower their material conditions. And again, even if you got a revolution, once wealth started being equalized across countries, the masses of the first world would turn on you, because they're used to their material wealth being at a particular level, and if you took that away, they would turn against you. So, I again, doing that, I don't see what good it would actually do. It would be a lot better to resist imperialism. Anti-imperialism is the best thing you can do. I know you're not personally in a party, but what is your opinion on joining parties in the first world? I would say look for one that is staunchly anti-imperialist. And by that I mean, actually tries to do something for imperialism, not something that just says it is, but doesn't really do anything. Stopping imperialism, since it is the primary contradiction, is the main goal. The idea of dividing the world into three came from a racist, arrogant Western perspective from the Cold War. Why would you keep using such a term? I would say it's a complete non sequitur, because we don't even mean it in the same way that they do. We have a different definition of what is first, second, and third world, so I don't think it matters. In what perspective does third world still apply, given that many nations like Venezuela, Cuba, China, Brazil, and South Africa have more in common with the first world than the typical third world country like Pakistan or Ethiopia? Some countries like India manage to be both close to first world and the third world, depending on the region you analyze. Well, I would say you can't call China, Brazil, third world, really deeply third world countries. I would say on the very low end of the continuum, but I wouldn't say that they have more in common with the first world, because they're still victims of imperialism in the end. China, not so much. China is in fact an imperialist power itself, so that would be closer to true about China than it would be of Brazil or Venezuela. South Africa, on the other hand, is different. Its makeup is a little bit more complicated. It does have a very clear imperialist past, particularly with its surrounding countries in the 1970s and Cubans volunteering to fight that, etc. India, I would still consider to be third world, because there is still huge mass poverty. There's a centralization of wealth in the hands of it looks larger because the population is so large, but really there is mass poverty in India. So I don't think it's closer to being the first world. Will you ever try to understand socialism in the 21st century in the Sao Paulo form, or do you consider them as heretics to the dogma of Maoism? From what I understand, 21st century socialism isn't Maoism. I don't get, 21st century socialism, from what I get, is from what Hugo Chavez has argued for, unless I'm wrong, because from what I understand, that is what Hugo Chavez argued. He's arguing going through the democratic process. Well, that's not going to work, because you don't have power until you take capital out of the hands of the capitalists. In fact, that's an error that I would highly criticize Venezuela for doing. They're not taking the approach to actually knock the bourgeoisie out of power. They're going through reform after reform, through democratic legal process, etc., to do all of this. One, screw the bourgeois legal process. I mean, if you're doing a revolution, why would you even follow that to begin with? Let alone to actually bring revolution. From what I understand, 21st century socialism is basically just reform until you get to socialism. And historically, that hasn't worked, so I don't know what the point of doing that would be. If communism is the end goal, wouldn't it be smart to have a left unity party, like in Britain, in their last election, have some kind of a starting point? The party stood for anti-corruption, anti-capitalism, democratic socialism, communist factions, even some left-wing nationalist factions. I would say, and how would that really change? I mean, it's not going to come through by voting. Socialism doesn't come around by the bourgeoisie accepting that there's a socialist government. I mean, that's just not going to happen. You're not going to get a peaceful transition. And even if you do create some kind of, pan-leftist kind of organization, it's going to end up eventually destroying itself because all the contradictions between those groups are going to fail. The point of the Vanguard Party is to lead the masses. They can, struggle unity with some groups, but in the end, the Vanguard Party has to be in front, leading. So these, and even like if you get a huge block of people that won't do revolution, I don't know what good that would be. Have you thought that the first world isn't ready for revolution because capital hasn't decayed enough yet? Yeah, that's kind of our point. Marx predicted that in the decomposition of capital as a first world worker, it is my job to send money to the third world communist group to help them in revolution. Yeah, I would say do that. Have you ever thought that a small but highly organized vanguard party could succeed in the first world? The Cuban Revolution was very tiny, and that's, that's what it did. I would say what you're arguing in that case is called focoism, the guerrilla foco or nucleus that was the experience of the Cuban Revolution, most highly theorized by Che. You create a really hardcore small group who go around and form the basis for a larger structure of rebellion. I would say let us look at the historical experience that focoism worked specifically in Cuba, but it failed everywhere else that he tried it. And I think that's his mistake there. He found something that worked one time, and he tried to replicate that in other countries. Bolivia, the Congo, even in Argentina he tried to do, and that failed before it even got off the ground. So I would say no, because what they were arguing was a hardcore nucleus be the leading struggle, but that's not actually a vanguard party. That's like a guerrilla organization. There really was no political end to that, being that there was no section of it that was political in doing that. It was just actual physical war. And that was mostly kept together by Crescencio Perez, who had such a huge network of family for supply work. This was a uniquely Cuban experience that they've not been able to replicate this anywhere else in the world every time it's been tried. So I don't see how that would work in the first world, because it only worked in a third world country at the one time. Would there be a future scenario in the first world where third worldism theory would become false? Example, overexploitation, global financial collapse. Well, that wouldn't prove third worldism wrong. That's kind of our point, that until there's a global, huge crash of the third world, a huge crash of the first world, there won't be any revolutionary potential in the first world. So if those things happen, that wouldn't prove us wrong. If that happened and they became revolutionary, that would actually prove us right, because that's what we've been saying. That being the case, what's the point of the channel? I don't mean to be a jerk, I'm asking sincerely. Since the channel is in English, the topics for the most part in the West or Western perceptions of the third world, like the DPRK, the audience seems to consist of Westerners. Why bother? Aren't you wasting your time addressing issues to an audience that is mostly reactionary anyway, a colossal waste of time, or at worst, an exercise in narcissism? Wouldn't it make more sense to address the issue and concerns of third world people in their own languages and ignore Western audiences altogether? This is a very good question. My channel didn't start that way. It started as reaching first world people, and I think that it still does that to this day. Just because the masses of the first world people are not revolutionary, that doesn't mean I can reach the elements of it that do have a revolutionary potential. Getting them to understand what's going on and raising a general consciousness of how capitalism is a problem. I mean, I've had a lot of people message me saying thanks for showing them how capitalism is a bad system and how there is a way out of it, even though they don't necessarily turn into third worldists. Raising that consciousness to a degree makes it possible for them to see third worldism in the future. And I would say, obviously, since I am reaching first world people, and the vast majority of my audience is American, well, speaking English is obviously the only way to go in that direction. My point isn't to reach third world people. I don't need to tell third world people that they're extremely poor and oppressed. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're already aware of that. So I would say my point is to reach a Western audience. It is to reach those small groups, those anomalies in the first world that are potentially revolutionary to reach them and win them over to our side. Do you support third world nationalism? Yes. In fact, I believe there's a big difference between nationalism in the first world and nationalism in the third world. First world nationalism is imperialism and chauvinism. In the third world, it's liberation. Again, that requires a much longer explanation that wouldn't fit in this whole video, because this video is already going to be pretty long as it is. Do you believe in revolution to be possible in the second world? Not in the Cold War sense, but rather the sense of newly industrialized nations. I think it's possible, depending on the individual conditions of each country. Like, again, you would have to go into an analysis of each individual country. But to answer your question, yes, I believe some second world countries, it actually is possible to build a revolution. Do you think that in the periods of extreme crisis, like something like a Great Depression, but even worse, there is revolution potential? Yes, this is what we are saying. We are saying that right now, in the way that first worlders live, they're not going to be revolutionary. I would say it would actually take something possibly even worse than a Great Depression. I'm talking like a total and complete utter collapse. Because we had a Great Depression before, and things sucked to the point where millions of people starved. Yes, I mean, that's something that's largely covered up, but yes, during the Great Depression, millions of people starved to death. And even then, they still wouldn't go to revolution. And I don't think that would really be any different now. So I think it would take more than a Great Depression. It would have to come to a total and complete annihilation of the economy in the United States. In other words, it has to go so far that the United States government ceases to exist. Can a third world revolution make the first world revolution possible? If not, why? Yes, actually I do believe that is possible, and we do believe that's possible. What we are saying is take the revolutionary potential of the third world, have them revolutionize, have them become like a pan-third worldist movement. Collectively together, cut off the first world from its base of exploitation. Essentially cut them off from all their value theft. Once you do that, the first world will collapse. The entire global imperialist system, capitalist imperialist system, is entirely, completely, and utterly dependent on that. If you took away that imperialist plunder, the system would be destroyed. And the United States, Britain, the UK, Australia, Japan would be gone. Even Russia as well. They would collapse overnight. Practically overnight. In that crash, revolutionary consciousness can develop. That's where we see it coming from. Once the third world cuts the first world off from its source of privilege and plunder, the revolutionary potential and class consciousness will begin to appear in the country. In what measure can first world communists help communists in the third world and the actual third world revolution? I would say the one major thing is cash. When wealth is hoarded into the first world, obviously, it would be easiest for first world people to come up with that money. Do whatever you think would be an adequate measure for doing so. Transferring as much wealth back to the third world in a revolutionary potential is possibly the best thing that you could do. But another thing that you could do, which would be more along the lines of what someone who's in the lower section of the population here could do, would be to do anti-imperialism. One of the best things we can do is to basically push an anti-imperialist line. I don't mean push an anti-imperialist line, I mean actually get the job done. For example, bring the troops home. If you pull the troops out of the country, that creates a tremendous amount of breathing space. I really wonder what the NPA in the Philippines could do if the U.S. wasn't occupying the country. What do you think that North Korea could do to South Korea if the U.S. didn't have tens of thousands of troops stationed there? What could Afghanistan would be right back in the hands of its own people the day coalition troops, NATO troops pulled out. The best thing we could do that's really reasonable, that doesn't involve, say, money, would be to end imperialism, bring the troops home, and allow them to have the breathing space necessary to revolutionize in their own countries. how much of a revolution potential is there in Eastern Europe, particularly the Balkans and Russia? Would you say that a revolution is possible in Russia after Putin leaves? I think that is a difficult question to answer because I don't think it's contingent on Putin at all. If anything, I would say Putin has had a negative effect on the revolutionary potential of Russia because he has created a great deal of solidarity by posing as a strongman against the United States and its imperialist aggression. Putin has played this whole game very, very well and has done very well in getting the Russian people to unite behind him. I would say that if he leaves, it doesn't really change anything. I don't see how it does anything. I don't see how that would help. Living conditions would remain relatively the same. There just wouldn't be as much solidarity. So I don't think it makes a difference. Maybe a bit off topic of Maoist third worldism, but do you think China can ever return to Maoism or Maoism third worldism? I think right now in its state, no. Because actually I wouldn't even consider China to be a third world country anymore. I think given the level of development now and the fact that there's a fairly strong middle class, I wouldn't consider it the poorest of the poor anymore. I would consider it middle class, being, at least as I see it, the second world is a continuum between the first and the third world. Meaning I don't think it has that revolutionary potential. Something would have to happen along those lines to crash it back a bit. I mean, I'm glad that there's a Maoist Communist Party there. We don't really have a lot of information on them. We don't see that much, but things would have to get a lot worse before we could, actually see something like that return. As a third worldist, someone who doesn't believe revolution can come from the first world, and a communist, someone who wants revolution, what keeps you going? What gives you hope? How are you not constantly depressed? Who says I'm not constantly depressed by that fact? But the point is that while I am not the poorest of the poor and that revolution isn't going to happen here in my lifetime, it doesn't mean that other people don't need it far more than I do. If you're really going to build revolution, you have to go and assist in the way that will actually work, even if it does directly go against your interests. Revolution still needs to be done. Just because it can't happen here, which it is kind of depressing knowing that it can't happen where I am and that it can't directly affect me the way I would like it to, it still needs to be done. And it's that and the need for it. Just because my suffering, isn't as bad as theirs and mine can't end, doesn't mean they don't still need that revolution. As a third worldist, do you support any group opposing U.S. imperialism, no matter who, even groups such as the Taliban? I don't support the Taliban. I don't like them. They're reactionary religious nut jobs. I think they're despicable. But the primary contradiction is kicking out the imperialists, which are objectively, and have proven to be objectively worse than the Taliban itself. Ending U.S. imperialism is the primary contradiction. While I don't support the Taliban, I really don't like them, just as nobody should like them, the U.S. has to lose. Imperialism has to lose. Question. In many third world countries, economic growth is higher than in the first world. Doesn't this mean the gap between the developed world and the developing world becomes smaller in revolutionary potential, and third worldism goes down, thus destroying the basis for the third worldist ideology in a couple of decades? No. I don't believe that, because you can't have them on the same level. Like, the third world is not going to come up to the level of the first world, because it's not possible. Capitalism is completely contingent on unequal exchange. In fact, that's the only way profit can even exist, is from an unequal exchange. So the third world cannot be raised up to the level of the first world. It's just not possible. For that to happen, there would have to be an equalization of global wealth. And if there's anything that capitalism has proven that it can't do, is equalize wealth. I was wondering, you said Maoism is the opposite of dogmatism, that since capitalism has evolved, so needed socialism, and that was Mao's contribution. Sorry, I'm reading the question, and the grammar's really messed up here. But you said that being a Leninist is basically saying that nothing has changed since 1917. Isn't being a Maoist saying that nothing changed since the 1950s, 1960s? Actually, yes, I agree. It is. Even Maoism itself is completely out of date. Look at the theory. The theory burned out around 1966 or maybe even 1969. Obviously, a new theoretical, contribution is necessary because these ideologies, Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, have run their course. They've gone as far as they can given the theory that it is that they've put forward. They're not necessarily wrong. They're just not developed according to the way things are now. And also, what do you suggest for leftist organizations in the first world, since I agree that, at least in Sweden where I live, that the leftist organizations have become gay pride and women's liberation movements with socialism as a second objective? Yes, that's identity politics. I mean, how do you really argue, for socialism when you already have something that's extremely social democratic as Sweden? I mean, it's pretty hard to make the argument that you're, exploited and oppressed in a country that's, as largely social democratic as Sweden is. So really, since they can't organize around class in those countries, they do have to organize around women's liberation, gay rights, etc. So they're doing that because they can't do class. Well, what do you suggest leftist organizations spend their time on? Should we all move to Nicaragua and help the revolution there, or is there a point in activism in the first world? I genuinely want to know. Well, the point would be anti-imperialism. I don't know the degree to which there is, Sweden's involvement in imperialism. I'm sure it is. If not in a direct and military way, then economically as well. I don't know what their particular degree is, but anti-imperialism should always be the main thing. And I don't think it's feasible that people should just move to Nicaragua and start fighting and doing revolution there. People just aren't going to do it. If some individual wants to do it, and they think they can, then by all means do so. But it's not reasonable to ask first world people to just pick up and move to the third world and start fighting. One big issue I can see arising from Mao's third worldist theory, for reference, I'm an ML with Maoist leanings, and its practice in the imperialist countries is individualism. Because if third world theory claims that there are no masses in the first world, then there is no real way to orientate yourself towards the masses. I would say that's not necessarily true. You couldn't orientate yourself towards them in a revolutionary way, but I mean, you could orientate towards them and carry out their national interest. It just wouldn't be revolutionary. So I just wanted to differentiate between that. You're left with a scattering of individualist intellectuals with no real mass discipline or ability to carry out revolutionary action. How do you propose that Maoist or worldists respond to this issue? Well, I would say if they're not capable of revolutionary action and they're just hyper-individualists, who cares? Just leave them. I don't really understand the question here. I don't know what it is that we need to respond to, like to make them revolutionary or to have them fulfill a positive role. I'm not really sure what the question is asking here. And that's the end of the questions that I'm going to answer. There were a lot of repeats, like the same question being asked over and over again by different people. So if I didn't get to your question, then I hope it was in there somewhere. So I apologize for this video taking so long to be done. It's just that, it was really, really long, and then I had to get everything together, and then I had to double check things, and, for anybody who's made YouTube videos, they know what I'm talking about in this regard. So, if I didn't answer your question, I'm sorry. I mean, I just literally couldn't answer, like, all 168 comments at the time, or at least the time when I did this. So I tried to speak to the most important ones possible. And thank you for watching. Why isn't there a successful revolution in the third world, and what must happen for there to be one? I would say largely this has to do with a lot of imperialist pressure. The governments of the first world can really throw a lot of unending amounts of resources into third world governments, imperialist puppets, to crush anyone that tries to revolutionize against them. I would also say that another big problem with them is that third world movements have a very stale theory that hasn't changed. Meaning they're not really updating anything. They're not putting forward a new theory. If you're losing and you're falling apart, you need to look at why it's happening and formulate something to understand why it's happening and how to change it. And I don't think that they're doing that, and that's a problem. What if workers in third world are successful, but people end up being ruled by a sociopathic tyrant that guarantees we won't replace one exploitation with another? Well, that would be the difference between capitalism and socialism. I don't really get what the question here, you're saying one crazy monster, straw man of Stalin? Well, then you'd get rid of them. And that's why you would have people's power or new power in order to deal with it. If in socialism there is no profit or greater financial gain, then what is people's motivation to produce and innovate? In other words, why would people work more than they have to if there is not a personal gain to it? Because people always have. This idea that you need that in order to do it is completely false. This wasn't true in the Soviet Union, this wasn't true in China, and this wasn't true in Cuba. People don't actually have to have a profit motive. They don't have to have a greater financial gain. Things were invented before there was a profit motive. Many of all the things were invented in the Soviet Union. You didn't need a profit motive. Look at the advancements that Cuba made. Did they need a profit motive to do that? No. It's just a commonly repeated thing that you must have a profit motive in order to do so. Innovation comes from necessity and creativity, not because someone's going to get paid. In fact, pretty much the opposite seems to be true quite often. How do you defend millions of people dying of hunger in Mao's China? Well, you see, Mao has magic powers that makes, crops stop growing. So that's how I defend that. What should people in the first world do to create a revolution in the third world? Well, I kind of already answered this one, but that would be to say, to send money to third world groups or to fight imperialism at home, cancel the occupations of countries and make this a serious thing to push for. What prevents third worlds from being capitalist like China rather than socialist? This would be that countries struggle. Two roads. You're going to go towards socialism or capitalism. The same thing that all of them would do. Recognize a reactionary revisionist line and fight it. It's the same kind of thing. Has China betrayed Mao by going capitalist? Yes, I would say that it has, but I would place some of that blame on Mao himself for having had, a lot of, reactionary ideas. He did. Later, near around the end of his life, he did have a reactionary, ideas. In the 21st century, what is a second world? At least in my opinion, it's the continuum between the first and third world. Countries that aren't completely oppressed, but they aren't the first world rich elite. Greece would be a good example of being on that scale. There would be other countries, some Eastern European countries would be on that scale. But again, it would depend on each individual country and where they would sit on that continuum. Would first world imperialism make any successful revolution in third world nations? No, because of possible military action from the West. Yes, it can happen. The biggest obstacle to revolution in the third world is interference by the first world. Could you please point out some differences between leading like communism, Maoism, and third worldism? On your blog, you've said they've merged Maoism and third worldism with some of their own ideas. Now that I've read through some of their stuff and that of other Maoist third worldist parties, I consider myself Maoist third worldist. I don't see a difference except the name. Well, the LLCO has some of their own ideas that don't exist in Maoism, third worldism, like high and low science. You've got an extremely high, complex, sophisticated system, theory at the top that people with education can understand. And then you have a lower, simplified version that people who are uneducated can understand. Like, you're not going to walk into a peasant village where people are uneducated and hand them a book of Phenomenology and the Spirit by Hegel, because they're not going to be able to read it, they're not going to be able to understand it, because they have no level of education. And one of the things that Mao did was simplify things. Like, we shouldn't attack everybody, and said that some people can be our allies. Don't hit out in all directions. He's got, very simplified ways of saying things for people who had very poor education. and the LOCO has a whole theoretical line specifically on that. And I think that's a good idea. So there's things like that. There's also parts that they don't take that are part of Maoism and third worldism, like nitpicking exactly, the mathematics of first world wages being taken from third world people. I mean, it's there. That's undeniable. But nitpicking little pieces of math aren't really all that necessary. Like for the value creation transferred between the two countries. I mean, come on, that's really obvious there. So that is kind of the difference. The LOCO has just taken a Maoist third worldist line and advanced it around their own ideas of theory. Like, they don't see dialectics as some kind of all-encompassing science that explains everything, because it doesn't. It's a good way of explaining things or understanding things, but it is not an all-encompassing science. Like, Mao uses dialectics to explain how a bomb works. Okay, now take that and go build a bomb with dialectics. Well, obviously that doesn't work. You would need to study engineering or chemistry. I mean, it's great for explaining things, but at the end of the day, it's not a super science that explains anything, because science evolves, but dialectics hasn't. I just think it's not the end-all, be-all of understanding things. It's just a really useful tool in many situations. Hey Jason, why did the ruling class, bourgeoisie, bourgeoisify the first world workers? Why do they share all the surplus value derived from imperialism, third world superexploitation, with so many first worlders? The main thing is to keep them pacified, so that they're not going to revolt. Like, for example, welfare is enough to keep people from taking up arms against the government. It's enough to keep out that extremely low poverty that would cause people to take serious action against the government. But look at the people who are the lowest of the low, people on Native American reservations. Their numbers are so small that even with their extreme poverty, they couldn't really do anything. I mean, you couldn't have a revolution based on Native American resistance, because that wouldn't spread to the rest of the country. You would have a racial resistance movement, which is not Marxism. I'm not saying that having a racial liberation movements are a bad thing. I'm saying it can't bring overall class revolution because it's based on race. The main thing is that it's enough to keep them from rising up, which is the point. Why would the poorest masses fight for Maoism, third worldism, when Marxian socialism has already failed Angola, Mozambique, Congo, Cambodia, Bulgaria, and every other Eastern Bloc country? Define failure. Cambodia, I don't recall Cambodia ever actually being socialist. Pol Pot was not a socialist. That's a whole nother video. That's a whole nother topic for discussion. Just because something was communist and then ceased to be communist isn't actually the fault of socialism. If those countries became socialist, does that mean that capitalism automatically failed? To see why each individual country is no longer socialist depends on that individual country. For example, the Eastern Bloc, Soviet revisionism basically caused that by moving away from socialism when it wasn't necessary to do so. So socialism didn't fail; it was betrayed. In fact, I think there's a book called Socialism Betrayed that actually explains that. But again, Marxism, socialism did not fail. It hasn't failed. Marxism, or capital, is a critique of capitalist economics. It isn't actually something that's put in the place of capitalism. That's what we have to construct. So it's kind of a twisted question. Say that the Third World Rise somehow would defeat the mighty American machine, thus step in the way of the global communist system, rather than a 70-year-long dictatorship of the proletariat scenario such as the Cold War. It's going to be a little bit different. The Soviet Union and the United States got locked into a Cold War because they were both superpowers. I would say that's actually different now, because we don't really, you don't have to beat them militarily. You have to be prepared to fight back, but you don't have to actually defeat the United States in a war. You only have to keep building revolutionary movements that cut off the United States from its supply of cheap labor and cheap resources. Once that super exploitation is gone, the United States will collapse. Like, you wouldn't really have to actually go to war against the United States. I mean, there's going to be skirmishes, of course, revolutions are bloody things, but not like a big, huge Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union as there was. What makes Maoism, Third Worldism any better than Luxemburgism or Trotskyism? None have ever surfaced in practice or form. That's a good question. Luxemburgism, it doesn't do anything. It's like trade unionism stuff that, doesn't work. Trotskyism is outright fucking reactionary. I mean, to even go into all of that would take forever. Maoism, Third Worldism is being applied right now in at least one country, and it's a case where we're going to have to see where it goes. But I think it's the most advanced theory there is that takes into consideration the changes in the global imperialist structure and the actual material conditions of the world, that in seeing how that they've changed. If the First Worldist line is of no revolutionary potential, could it not be of use for agitation in the First World, revolutions taking place in the Third World? Actually, I would say no. I would say that it actually doesn't. Because one of the things, and I don't have the time in this to go completely into a full explanation of that, but that is in an upcoming book. First Worldists argue things that are completely useless, that don't work. Like, they go around saying, well, we're going to argue for raising the minimum wage, which the Democrats are already doing. Why would anybody run off and join a quote-unquote revolutionary group when they can get the exact same thing by voting Democrat? They push identity politics, trans, race, all these other things, which the Democrats are already doing. Homosexual rights are already being pushed by the Democrats anyway. So why would you go and join this revolutionary group when you can get the same thing from a mainstream bourgeois party where you wouldn't even have to actually do anything? The First Worldist line is not even revolutionary. I mean, look at what happens. Some workers get together and they form a workers' co-op, and then they turn around and say, look, see, they've done something revolutionary. If a workers' co-op was revolutionary, wouldn't the bourgeoisie smash that thing down and destroy it? Wouldn't the police move in and get rid of it? It doesn't challenge them. You essentially just built another corporate capitalist enterprise. It doesn't challenge the system, which is why they don't care. See, they're not doing anything, and when they do something, it isn't even challenging the system anyway. So I don't know what the point of following them would be. And we know that we can't get, the first world mass on our side, because we're asking them to go directly against their interests. Now, First Worldists should understand this, but they don't want to hear it. So the First Worldist line is really nothing more than maintaining the privilege and wealth of the First World, because one, it presents no threat to it, and two, it doesn't have any concept of transferring value back to the Third World where it came from. In one of the largest poor countries in the world, such as India, strict gun control in place. How would the masses ever arm themselves? Well, the same way they've done it before. I mean, the Naxals get their guns. So, I mean, it's there. You just have to illegally obtain them somehow and possibly even manufacture your own depending on your level of development. Because there's always somebody willing to sell guns to you no matter what. Do you think that the theory of socialism in one country is a plausible way to support a third world revolution than permanent revolution? I believe it could be, since socialism in one country has a realistic means towards a universal revolution than permanent revolution. Okay, permanent revolution right off is a complete failure. Assuming you can get two trots to agree with the same definition of permanent revolution. Basically, it said the Soviet Union should hold back and wait and get the support of the working class in Germany to support them and aid them after they have a revolution there. Yeah, well, they kind of turned into Nazis, so that really didn't work. I mean, who's to say that you can't build a base of socialism in one country and then begin exporting and supporting revolutions in other countries? That way actually does work, and that has led to it. Like a lot of people like to say, socialism in one country has created many revolutions in many countries. Permanent revolution has created a revolution in no countries. Yes, socialism in one country is still obviously the only answer.